I'm Pamela Marshall at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Radio TV podcast. Welcome to the Timbuktu Report, where it is educate, inspire. Hey, am I getting feedback from you?
No, you're not getting feedback, but you're going in and out.
I am.
Now you're not. Technology, right?
Humans. on the Timbuktu Report, our goal is to inspire, educate, and encourage you to learn more and investigate on your own. My guest, as always, on the Timbuktu Report is Dr. Rick Stevenson, who's a professor of African American Studies and African American History at the University of Florida, Gainesville, Florida. Dr. Stevenson, welcome. How are you?
I am well, thank you. Good to see you. How have you been?
I've been percolating right along, Dr. Stevenson. How have you been?
Doing pretty well, actually. I'm excited about tonight's topic.
Yeah, urban renewal, urban removal.
Yeah.
Impact that the progress in the United States of America has had on African American communities across the country. And in the early days, doing it without any regard, without public hearings, without any decision-making process that was even in place to find out what the impact would be on the culture of African Americans. That is our topic today on the Timbuktu Report. I do hope you will not only you join us, but share this. If you're joining us live on YouTube, please share it. If you're on Facebook, please share it. If you're on LinkedIn, please share it. We have a responsibility to tell our own stories, and that's what we are doing, regardless of what anybody else is doing. We're going to talk about Amanda Gorman book being pulled in a Florida school when we come back. But before we do that, as we always do, Dr. Stevenson is also a man of the cloth, so if you would, take us to the Lord in prayer.
I'm going to pray that you don't keep going in and out, too.
Yeah.
Lord, thank you so much for another opportunity to share truth and to dig into the depths of our history, to enlighten our listeners to the history and the background and experiences of people of African descent. We are grateful that you have given us this platform, and we pray that you are pleased and honored with all that we do and say. In the name of Jesus, amen.
All right, Dr. Stevenson. So you say I'm going in and out?
You were, yes. No, I just left. I just went in too. I can't see myself. I'm spiraling. There we go. I'm back.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Dr. Stevenson, in this banning of books in Florida, one parent has gotten Amanda Gorman's book pulled because it contains the poem that was used in the last inauguration. Where are we with this? Mm-hmm.
I did not know that.
Yeah, there was a phrase in the poem that a parent objected to. And the fact that it's only been about 11 people who've gotten all of these books pulled in various school districts. And the fact that the complaint of a handful of people is impacting the learning of children across this state is really, really uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's there's always been a dilemma of where Black people fit in the minds, the neighborhood, and society of white people. They're always trying to figure out, historically how we play into their existence. And I think that using the government as an instrument to curtail and to disenfranchise us it's not unnatural. Historically speaking, government sponsored or initiated programs are usually designed to oppress, control, or deprive people of color. So this is just another example of how the government, which is white supremacist in a sense, continues to slap us in the face when it comes to our not only our constitutional rights, but to the contributions that we've made to the very existence of this nation.
And as we're talking about the banning of certain books in the schools across this state and across the country, the story of urban renewal, that it's been called urban renewal, when in fact it really was urban removal
Exactly.
of Black people from economic hubs for their community, and systematically destroyed some cultures in our communities. Now, you take Seneca Village, for an example, where Central Park is now located.
Mm-hmm.
Just the decision to wipe out a part of New York that was built by a 26-year-old African American. And they just wiped it out and built Central Park. And now everybody is happy without regards to our feelings.
Yeah.
Which is interesting about these books and about teaching certain parts of our history, to say that we don't want to hurt other children's feelings, but our feelings are still not being considered.
Exactly. You know, there's a one of the books I use in one of my classes. I don't know if I should use the name of it because they might ban it. But anyway, the title of the book is "The Color of Law." It's by Richard Rothstein, and it's the forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And he makes this statement talking about how highways were built and why they were built. And in 1962, the Highway Research Board boasted that interstate highways were eating out slums and reclaiming blighted areas. Now, one thing we have to ask ourselves is, how did these slums develop? And that's a whole different question. Um, but it goes on to say this, that Alfred Johnson, the executive director of the American Association of State Highway Officials, was a lobbyist. And he says this, that Johnson said some city officials expressed the view in the 1950s that urban interstates would give them, watch this now, a good opportunity to get rid of the local nigger towns. And the whole purpose of these freeways, which normally ran through Black and brown communities, was to eliminate these living neighborhoods. Now, what I said earlier, we have to ask the question, how did this thing happen? When the Second Industrial Revolution began to radicalize America with new technologies, new manufacturing, new urban environments, trolley cars, telephones, all this industry began to mobilize people. And many of the people who left the South to come to the North to work in these industries, that's where they ended up. New York City was number one largest city. The second largest city was Chicago. The third largest city was Philadelphia. And that's where you have these large swaths of Black people coming to work in the industry. And because they were in these one urbanized places, when white America got tired of it, they tore the cities down. They ran highways right through their neighborhoods.
And in the case of Motor City, when you can just decide to shut the facilities down
Absolutely.
and create such blight. And then at such time when one decides that it is time to reclaim these places, they get them for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And the African Americans who did own homes and businesses have had to move on. This part of our history of removing of Black people from these communities, talk about the impact that that's had on our culture.
Oh my God. One, it had a significant impact on our ability to maintain and to develop wealth, because they were constantly taking our property, even though in many cases they wouldn't even give us property. They wouldn't even sell us homes. I don't know if you know it, but you know, a lot of the reasons that Black people didn't own homes in the early 1930s and 40s is because of restrictive covenants, which was a relationship between homeowners, bank loans, and real estate agencies who would not sell to Blacks. Two, redlining, where they would redline a city and say these are the only places we're going to sell houses. And then blockbusting, where they would come into a neighborhood and tell people that when Black people come in, brown people come in, the property value will decrease, and therefore they have this white flight where people who lived in the urban environment would go into the suburbs, And now the landlords or the slumlords would not take care of the property and then blame it on the occupants who happen to be African American on the reason why the community was going down. And so you have this systemic and systematic hand, if you will, of government officials and 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 financial organizations that eliminated our ability to build wealth. The second thing is when you can't build wealth, you can't pass wealth on to the next generation. Think about it. Since I've been here, I've met people who make statements like, I'm going down to a home that my parents left us down in Marina Del Rey. And I said, well, how'd they get that? Well, my grandfather, had it, and he left it to my dad, and so my dad left it to us. How many black people can do that? How many black families have had the ability or the opportunity to receive land or homes or wealth from their parents or their grandparents because it was passed on? And so these kind of things have affected our ability to not only build economically, but to build inheritances for our children.
Dr. Rick Stevenson, we're talking about urban renewal, which it's a really great phrase. But in fact, it's been the urban removal of African Americans from cities across the country, as well as removing and destroying the culture, the foundation of many communities that were thriving.
Exactly.
Doing quite well. I was in New Orleans, and Treme is one of those neighborhoods that was impacted by the interstate that came through there.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Stevenson, when you're talking about this, like this insidious relationship with the African American, you tear it down, you go knock the anthill over, and then say these ants won't keep anything up. They won't do anything for themselves. They're trifling and lazy.
Right. That is so important. That is so interesting that you would bring that up, because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is in the early 1900s, the majority of the black population lived in the South. They lived in rural environments, but industrial expansion and population growth radically changed the whole face of the country, right? Noise, traffic jams, slums, air pollution, sanitation issues, health problems became commonplace because so many people are now leaving these rural environments and they're going into the urban environments, and these environments are not able to handle this level of population. Then you have on top of that the development of mass transit. Mass transit came into existence because now that you have this population growth, you have people moving out of the urban environment into a suburban environment, but they're coming back into the city so they can work. So you have the cable cars, you have subways, you have the invention of the skyscraper, right? A new invention on how to develop metal so that you can build these high buildings. The reason that these buildings were called skyscrapers is because as they began to go higher and higher and higher, they were said to have scraped the sky. And so now, even the way we house people, as opposed to building sprawling environments over acreage, we're going up in the air, which means you can put more people in a very small space and you can control that population. And so all these kinds of factors go into how the urban environment becomes this evolutionary change, if you will, for the way that we live together. And then, this is really what gets me, when they start building these projects, the projects become an instrument where you can localize a group of people and they can't really. You look at New York City, you can have 5 projects, 24 floors apiece, 20 apartments on one floor, and they're all going straight up in the air. And then they're all housed in one small area. And some of those people live in those projects for 3 and 4 generations because you can't afford to buy anywhere else.
And then those projects that also dictated who could live in the house. You're a woman, you have to have children to be there, but you
Mm.
can't have a man. So where are you supposed to get the children?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
then it's called single moms and deadbeat dads
Hmm.
because it was orchestrated that way. Dr. Stevenson, this is still the month where we're talking about mental health.
Hmm.
Speak to this and the psyche of African Americans. Yeah, to be quite honest with you, when I use the anthill, I feel bad if I knock over an anthill
Hmm.
because I know that that's a family.
Hmm.
Those are ants who have some relationships to each other. And as much as I don't want them biting me,
Hmm.
still understand that they're alive. They are a community.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what does it do to the psyche of the African American in the 20s and 30s and when they were building, and then all of a sudden, without any regard to what has been built, it gets torn down?
Right. I think there's a couple things we have to take into account. The first thing we have to think about is how differently the black community develops, period, as compared to the white community. Remember now, our foreparents who were brought here from Africa may have been a part of a group. And then a slave auction may occur and someone is sold, which means now the community is in flux because let's just say a husband, a mother, and a father have a child on a plantation. And then the plantation owner decides to sell the father. So now it's just the mother and the child. Now, because of the way the plantation was oftentimes set up, another person would step in to be the mentor or the leader or the guide for that young child. And then so now the communities take on a different face, right? You have this extended family concept. And then you move north. You move north because one, you want to get away Jim Crow. Two, you want to get away from possibly being murdered. Three, you want to get a chance to make a little bit more money. So you finally get into a position where you can begin to take care of yourself, and then you're pushed out of that home again. You've already left the South. You probably don't have anyone up here to help you, and you're trying.
Fleeing. I think we say left the South,
Yeah.
but in reality, people were fleeing.
Fleeing the site. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why I mentioned. Yeah. Fleeing murder,
Yeah.
fleeing lynchings, etc. Exactly. But then you get north and you're starting all over again. And you finally get your roots settled, and here they come again. Now, an example of that is Tulsa, Black Wall Street. We start building community, we build wealth, we build a society where we're non-dependent on the dominant culture. And what happens? They burn the city down. Does that happen on a regular basis? Absolutely. You can look at Rosewood. You can look at Ocoee. You can look at St. Louis. You can look at parts of Chicago and Illinois, where Black people come together in community, begin to strive. And the moment we begin to strive, there is this rage. There's a book called White Rage by Carol Anderson. And she talks about that one of the things that causes white America to get so upset is when we begin to progress on our own, because the assumption is the moment we get to a position where they can no longer control us, they can no longer control us.
Yeah.
And so how do we stop that? We tear and burn the city down.
And it impacts the psyche of African Americans. For
Exactly.
African Americans who are not achieving today, who don't realize that they're under the um, emotional post-traumatic stress syndrome
Exactly.
that is in our DNA of being uncomfortable at achieving things because of what has happened.
Absolutely. There's a
Doc-
book that I would recommend you read too. And that same thing is called Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroy. And she talks about the stress that comes from the fear of being successful, because once you achieve, are you going to lose it?
Dr. Stevenson, all of you who are watching, please like and share. Share more than like, whether you like or not, but share, because it's our goal to say, fine, take the books out of the school. but we have the ability to educate each other and ourselves. And it's through tapping into the brilliance of people like Dr. Rick Stevenson, who can come on this show and share information so that we can understand where we are and why we're where we are.
Right.
Listen, the effects of urban renewal plans in the United States included the destruction of low income and minority neighborhoods, urban renewal.
Mm-hmm.
The plan was to, as you said at the top of the show, to tear down low income and minority neighborhoods, displacement of vulnerable residents,
Mm-hmm.
reduction of low cost housing, getting rid of low cost housing, in inner cities areas, increased economic inequality.
Mm-hmm.
Between 1949 and 1973, over 1 million US residents were displaced
Yeah.
to find on their own, to do the best that they could, and displaced, carrying with them the emotional trauma of their homes, their
Mm-hmm.
neighborhoods,
Mm-hmm.
their culture being destroyed under the heading of urban renewal.
Absolutely. According to Rothstein, he says in 1943, the American Concrete Institute urged the construction of urban expressways for the elimination of slums and blights. In 1949, the American Road Builders Association wrote to the President Truman that if interstates were properly routed through metropolitan areas, they could contribute in a substantial manner to the elimination of slums and deteriorating areas. They decided, okay, we want to get rid of. We'll run a freeway right through their neighborhood. But
Right.
what's interesting, now you have gentrification, right? Now the people who ran through the suburbs, they're coming back into our communities, buying up our homes, tearing up our neighborhoods, and re-gentrifying them in such a way that now, again, you're displacing black and brown people, and white people are moving back where they once left.
Well,
Amazing.
creating a space again, as you said, in a place that they cannot afford.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Intentionally creating a place, so it's economic apartheid
Mm-hmm.
in a place where they cannot afford, intentionally in a place where they can't afford. And so even today, how do we know that the price that you're given is the same price that somebody else is giving?
Exactly, and there are studies on that too. There's an
Oh,
article.
really?
Say again?
I just said, really?
Yeah. There was a study done where they started looking at, they would send a black person and a white family and a black family into the same neighborhood to buy a house, and the price differentiation was oftentimes anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000 different if you were African American, higher than if you were a white population. But there's this article called "City Life in the Late 19th Century" that says this. Between 1880 and 1900, cities in the United States grew at a dramatic rate. Owing most of the population growth to the expansion of industry, U.S. cities grew by about 15 million people in 2 decades between 1900s. Many of those who helped account for the population growth of the cities were immigrants arriving from around the world. So the other issue is not only do you have the migration from the South, but you also have all of these foreigners coming in, right? From Spain and from France and from Europe. And they're coming into these big cities. A steady stream of people from rural America also migrated to the cities during the period. And between 1880 and 1890, almost 40% of the townships in the U.S. was populated by migration.
Hmm.
40%.
Wow.
So you have this law, and what's happening is there wasn't an infrastructure in place to accommodate the population growth. So who do you eliminate? The ones that you call inferior.
Hmm.
It's crazy, man. And that's why, it's so important for us to understand history. I was looking at this article that talked about New York, and it was talking about how unsanitary New York was. They had, a lot of the tenement homes. Do you know what a tenement home is?
Like boarding houses?
something like that. Yeah, some of them didn't have running water.
Mm.
Some didn't have outdoor plumbing. Some of them you couldn't flush the toilets. The sanitation, the rats and the rodents in the city was just through the roof. And many of these foreigners lived in those environments, and so there was no middle class. So you have the upper class, the wealthy people who are living in the Wall Street areas, but then you have the poor. And so when this migration begins, the dominant class has to figure out, how are we going to accommodate these people, make money, and yet make sure that certain people don't live into our neighborhoods. And that's how they begin to separate these environments based on culture, based on language, based on skin color, etc.
Our discussion tonight is getting a better understanding of how the interstate in your community was located, where it's located, and based on history in the United States of America. Many of those interstates were placed where they were, are
Mhm.
constructed where they're constructed, with the intent of getting rid of African Americans who had migrated, who had fled the South, fleeing, running for their safety.
Mhm.
Dr. Stevenson, today, as you pointed out, we now have this reversal thing happening called gentrification, but
Mhm.
it's still under the umbrella of cleaning up blighted areas.
Right, right.
And no one asked the question, well, how did this pocket get blighted? Is it
Exactly.
blighted just because people have brown skin live there? Or did you make sure there were no resources put
Right.
in that community, or no requirements? There's some communities, there's a covenant about what you have to do with your yard and
Ex-
about trash pickup and that sort of thing. But if
ex-
you have a community where there's none of that exists,
mhm.
and trash pickup is not what it's supposed to be, no requirements on anything,
Mhm.
and many times landlords are not required to maintain the properties up to standard. We have that right here in Gainesville, Florida,
Right.
in some buildings that are now Section 8. The entire swag community, all of those apartments are now Section 8, and you drive through there, and it's almost like you're in another
Mhm.
city. Have you been there?
No, I've not been there, but not to that specific place, but I have seen it. And
Yeah.
again, it goes to what I said earlier about redlining, right? It's where the government decides, okay, if we have to give them some place to live, this is where it's going to be. And oftentimes it falls under the guise of what we call environmental injustice or environmental racism. You also have the issue of food deserts in these environments, right? So there's a number of different factors that go into how these environments begin, how these living spaces begin to get blighted. You have landlords or slumlords who don't take care of the property. And like you said, even the sanitation of the communities tend to be subpar because they're not concerned about that environment. Up the some of the places where you and I may live, we have standards on what our grass has to look like and how high it can be, how it can grow, and what colors you can paint your house. And then you'll go 9 or 10 blocks away, and it's just the opposite.
So I would like, for those who are watching, I certainly would love to hear your comments on this topic, urban renewal that has been the removal of African Americans and their culture. So, Dr. Stevenson, as this has been going on systematically, as I said before, between 1949 and 1973, I believe, more than 1 million people displaced. What has kept us going?
Us black people,
Hmm. What do you
tenacity.
What do you think?
I think some of it is the pride of being able to to handle the stress and the oppression that the dominant culture has placed upon us, and still figure out what I call Afro engineering, how
Hmm.
we take the very minimum and do magnificence with it. I think that we're constantly in a space where we're trying to have to prove to ourselves and to everyone else that no matter what you throw at us, we're going to succeed. I think it's just a level of pride and self-worth.
Yeah, we can figure it out.
Yeah, I remember. I'll give you an example.
So
When I was
you,
in junior high school, I told a counselor that I wanted to go to college and be a teacher, and she said to me, she said, "Well, you people don't do well in college. Why don't you just get a trade?" And I told my
it's
mother,
because you didn't know that the first college was on the continent where you came from.
exactly,
If you'd been armed with that,
exactly,
you would have had a comeback for her. You could have said, "But how can you say that? I,
right,
I come from, my ancestors built the pyramids, and
right,
there's no reason to say it."
yeah. I didn't know that then, and
Exactly.
yeah,
On purpose. That's my whole point.
yeah, yeah, and so I eventually, I went to college and got a couple degrees and so on. And I went back looking for her because I wanted to show her that she was wrong. And but in the process, I had a breakdown when I was in my 40s. And when I started going to a health professional, one of the things that came out of it was that I realized that all those years from junior high school to my first doctorate degree, I was trying to prove that woman wrong.
Mm. Wow.
And I was not going to allow what she told me as a junior high school student to be true. And a lot of us are in that space where someone has said, you're not good enough, or you're not smart enough, or you're not tall enough, or your hair's too kinky, or you're overweight, or whatever the thing may have been. And that has been the fuel that has driven us to various types of successes.
Dr. Rick Stevenson, congratulations on what you have achieved in spite of that negative energy that came into your mind that you were able to overcome. I believe, as you said, we have such tenacity,
Mhm.
even though, as Maya Angelou said, you can do all these things and still I rise.
Instant. Exactly. Exactly.
Still we
It's
rise.
like it's like ashes from a phoenix, right?
Right, right. And still we rise.
And still we rise.
Yeah, Dr. Rick Stevenson, we have been talking about the impact of what was called urban renewal in the United States of America that turned out to be intentional on destroying. As a matter of fact, the picture that you see behind me is a street in Treme in New Orleans.
Mhm.
Um, Louis Armstrong Park is right down that street. If you hopped in the picture and kept straight, you would run into Louis Armstrong Park.
Right.
Uh, which has a lot of history in how they came through and tore down houses
Hmm.
or picked them up and moved them.
Hmm.
Please continue to talk about this, talk about the history that we can tell ourselves. When we hear that they're taking it out of the schools, just go, okay, we dig deeper at home and start to teach and tell our stories as we have historically. That's why we have the story that we have now, is because great grandfathers and great grandmothers have told those stories. We are storytellers, and
Hmm.
we need to get back to who we are in telling our own stories to each other.
Hmm.
There's a viewer that said best degree he received was his Mr. degree. Oh, to Mrs. Mr. to Mrs. Victoria. Victoria, we really appreciate you watching so much, and please share. Broad and phenomenal session tonight. Thank you both. Thank you so much for watching. We really do appreciate you watching, as well as everyone else who watched the Timbuktu Report. The Timbuktu Report, a program that Dr. Stevenson agreed to be a part of almost 3 years ago now, huh? Maybe 4.
Yeah, going on 4. Isn't that something?
Going on 4.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for being a part of the show. To your wife, Victoria, thank you for allowing us to borrow him for 45 minutes to an hour every week to share his brilliance with those who are watching. And I just really, really appreciate it so much because I think what you share with us is just invaluable. So, sir, thank you, and I salute you.
Thank you.
Everybody, I really appreciate you watching. If you don't have a copy, and I'm not talking to anybody that I see, if you don't have a copy of The Art of Forgiveness, please get that. Hey, guess what? I am going to be at the Church of God in Christ Women's Convocation starting Sunday. 10 to 15,000 people
Wow.
at this event. They've asked me to bring 1,000 books. Prayerfully, I
Wow.
leave there with an empty wagon.
Awesome.
If you're going to be in Orlando at the Church of God in Christ Women's Convention, please stop by my booth. I think it's 502 or 205, one of the two. I'm excited. I'm looking forward. It's my first time doing anything like that. So I'm excited about that.
It's going to be amazing. I'm looking forward.
Yeah, looking forward.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be back here next week with a topic that always with a goal of inspiring, educating, and enlightening. I'm Pamela Marshall at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Radio TV podcast. Remember, there is healing
At the well.